The crack of a pistol shot echoed through the stillness of Cottonwood Creek, shattering Violet Gardner's last hope as she watched her husband's coffin being lowered into the unforgiving Texas soil. The year was 1875, and at 22, Violet found herself a widow in a land that offered little mercy to women without protection. "All that trouble for nothing," Margaret Quinn muttered, standing rigidly beside Violet, her black mourning dress crisp despite the summer heat. "My son married a woman who cannot even provide an heir. What use are you now?" Violet flinched but kept her gaze fixed on the grave. She'd endured 2 years of such barbs since marrying Thomas Quinn, 2 years of trying to prove herself worthy to a mother-in-law who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for grandchildren that never came. "I'll manage, Mrs. Quinn," Violet replied softly, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I have the small house Thomas left me. That shack on the edge of town," Margaret scoffed. "You'll be destitute within a month, a woman with no skills, no children, and no purpose. Utterly useless." The words cut deeper than Margaret could know. Violet had spent years hearing the same from her own father before Thomas had courted her. Useless, too bookish, not pretty enough, too willful. Thomas had been her escape, her chance at building something of her own. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that swept through Cottonwood Creek like wildfire. As the small gathering of mourners dispersed, Violet remained, watching the gravediggers complete their solemn task. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and she felt as hollow as the grave before her. "Miss Gardner," Violet turned to find Sheriff Cooper standing awkwardly, hat in hand. "Mrs. Quinn," she corrected gently. "At least for now," the sheriff nodded. "Mrs. Quinn." "I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man." "Thank you, Sheriff. I don't mean to intrude on your grief, but there's the matter of Thomas's debts." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid the bank is looking to collect. The drought's been hard on everyone, and Thomas borrowed heavily for that cattle venture that never panned out." Violet felt the ground tilt beneath her. "Debts, but the house—" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Quinn. The house will likely be seized to cover what's owed. Mr. Harrington at the bank says you have 2 weeks to settle accounts or vacate." 2 weeks. Violet's mind reeled. "I understand. Thank you for telling me." The sheriff departed with a respectful nod, leaving Violet alone with a fresh grave and the crumbling ruins of her future. The walk back to town was long and dusty. Cottonwood Creek had sprouted up around a trading post 15 years earlier and now boasted a main street with a general store, saloon, bank, and a handful of other establishments. Violet's little house no longer hers, it seemed sat on the eastern edge, a modest one-room structure with a small garden plot that had withered in the relentless drought. As she approached, she saw Margaret Quinn waiting on her porch, straight-backed and severe. "I've come to collect Thomas's personal effects," Margaret announced without preamble. "Family heirlooms should return to family." Violet stepped past her and unlocked the door. "Of course, please come in." The interior was spare but neat. Violet had taken pride in creating a home with their limited means. A quilt she'd stitched herself covered the bed. Wildflowers in a jar adorned the table. Books, her one indulgence, lined a single shelf. Margaret moved through the space like an inspector, collecting Thomas's pocket watch, his father's Bible, a silver letter opener. She paused at the shelf of books. "Always with your head in clouds," she muttered. What good did reading ever do for a woman's practical needs? "No wonder you couldn't give Thomas children." Violet stiffened but said nothing. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only invited more criticism. "Sheriff Cooper informed me of Thomas's debts," Margaret continued. "I won't be covering them. Thomas made his choice when he married you instead of the Henderson girl. She would have brought property to the marriage, not just pretty words and empty promises." "I never asked for your help," Violet said quietly. Margaret's lips thinned. "What will you do then?" "You have no family here, no skills beyond keeping a barely adequate house. You're utterly useless in the real ways that matter." The words hung in the air like smoke. Violet met her mother-in-law's gaze steadily. "I'll find my way, I always have." Margaret gathered Thomas's belongings into a small bundle. "The Quinn name has standards to uphold. Whatever you decide, Don't embarrass my son's memory." After Margaret left, Violet sank onto her bed, allowing tears to flow for the first time since Thomas had drawn his last labored breath 3 days earlier. She had loved him in her way, though their marriage had been more a partnership of convenience than passion. He had been kind, if distant, providing shelter from her father's home and Margaret's disapproval. Now she had nothing. No husband, no house, no prospects. At 22, she faced a choice between begging for charity or finding work scarce for women in a town like Cottonwood Creek, where options were limited to cooking, cleaning, or the saloon. Violet's gaze fell on her bookshelf. Among the novels and poetry collections was a worn copy of The Prairie Homemaker's Guide, a practical manual on frontier living she'd studied religiously. Thomas had laughed at her dedication to mastering skills from cheese making to leather repair, but she'd persisted. Knowledge her mother had taught her before passing was never wasted. Maybe, just maybe, those skills could save her now. The next morning, Violet rose before dawn. She gathered her few treasured possessions, her mother's cameo, her books, a sewing kit, and walked to the general store as it opened. "Mrs. Quinn," Mr. Davis greeted her with awkward sympathy. "My condolences on your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Davis. I've come with a proposition." The storekeeper raised his eyebrows. "Oh, I understand your wife has been unwell since the baby came. You're short-handed, especially with inventory and accounts." Violet stood tall despite her pounding heart. "I can read, write, and calculate figures better than most. I'm organizing my husband's affairs and realized I might offer my services to you. Part-time, perhaps in exchange for store credit until I'm established." Mr. Davis rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's not usual to have a woman handling accounts." "Unusual times call for unusual measures," Violet replied, "and I'm discreet. No one need know who's keeping your books." After consideration, Davis agreed to a trial arrangement. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a foothold against destitution. For the next week, Violet split her time between settling Thomas's affairs and working in the back room of Davis's store. She discovered Thomas's debts were even greater than she'd feared. The cattle investment had been a desperate gamble, leveraged against their house and everything they owned. There would be nothing left once the bank took its due. On the 8th day after Thomas's burial, Violet was walking home from the store when she heard Margaret Quinn's voice from inside the millinery shop. "Absolutely shameless," Margaret was saying to Mrs. Henderson. "Working at the store like a common clerk. My son barely cold in his grave and she shows no proper respect for mourning." "Perhaps she has no choice," Mrs. Henderson suggested. "Thomas's debts are common knowledge. She had choices," Margaret sniffed. "I offered to arrange a position for her as a housekeeper with my cousin in Austin. Appropriate for a woman of her station. But no, too proud, or perhaps she has other plans. I've seen how the Walker boy looks at her. Vultures circle quickly when a man dies." Violet hurried past, cheeks burning. The Walker boy was 30 if a day, and had indeed been making unwelcome overtures since Thomas's passing. The suggestion that she would entertain such attention during her mourning period was both insulting and dangerous to her reputation. That evening, as Violet packed her meager belongings, a knock came at her door. She opened it cautiously to find Mrs. Holbrook, the midwife, standing on her porch. "Evening, Violet," the older woman said kindly. "May I come in?" Violet welcomed her, grateful for one of the few people in town who had always treated her with genuine warmth. "I heard about your situation," Mrs. Holbrook said, settling into Violet's single chair. "The bank's deadline is approaching." "Yes." Violet folded a dress carefully. "I'm considering my options. That's why I'm here. My sister in Silverdale has written asking if I know anyone who might help her. She runs a boarding house for respectable working women, mostly teachers and shop girls. She needs someone to assist with meals, correspondence, and general management." Violet's heart quickened. "Silverdale, that's nearly 50 miles west." "Yes, but it's growing faster than Cottonwood Creek. The silver mines are bringing prosperity and with it, opportunities for a woman of intelligence." Mrs. Holbrook smiled. "Elizabeth writes that she's getting too old to manage alone. The position includes room and board plus a small salary." "It sounds perfect," Violet admitted, But how would I get there? The stagecoach fare is beyond my means now. As it happens, Mason Quinn is driving cattle to Silverdale the day after tomorrow. He might be persuaded to take a passenger. Violet stiffened. Mason Quinn, Thomas's cousin, second cousin, I believe, Margaret's nephew's boy. He's not much like the rest of them, though. Runs his own spread north of here. Comes through a few times a year. Violet had met Mason Quinn exactly once, at her wedding to Thomas. He'd been a tall, quiet presence who'd kept to himself before riding out early. Thomas had mentioned him occasionally, always with a mixture of admiration and resentment for his cousin's independence from the family's expectations. I couldn't impose, Violet began, but Mrs. Holbrook waved her objection away. Nonsense. The man's making the journey anyway. I already spoke to him at the livery. He said he'd be happy to escort you safely to Silverdale, provided you're ready at first light the day after tomorrow. Violet sat stunned by this sudden lifeline. Why would you help me this way? Mrs. Holbrook's eyes softened. Because I remember being young and alone after my husband died in '62. Someone helped me then. We women must look out for one another in this harsh country. After Mrs. Holbrook left, Violet finished packing with renewed purpose. A new town, far from Margaret Quinn's cutting remarks and the pitying glances of Cottonwood Creek's residents. A real job with dignity. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she married Thomas, but perhaps it could be something better, something that was truly hers. Dawn had barely broken when Violet carried her single trunk to the livery stable 2 days later. The eastern sky was streaked with pink and gold, promising another scorching summer day. She wore her sturdiest dress and boots, her hair neatly pinned beneath a practical bonnet. A tall figure was adjusting the harness on a wagon loaded with supplies. He turned at her approach, and Violet recognized Mason Quinn. He was broader than she remembered, sun-darkened and solid in a way Thomas never had been. His features carried the Quinn family's strong jawline, but his eyes were different, warm amber rather than the cold blue that characterized Margaret and Thomas. "Mrs. Quinn," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not late." "Not at all, Mr. Quinn, and please call me Violet." "I won't be Mrs. Quinn much longer," he nodded. "Mason, then, let me take your trunk." He loaded her belongings easily, then helped her onto the wagon seat with a strong, calloused hand. The touch was impersonal but sent an unexpected warmth through her fingers. "It'll be a 3-day journey if the weather holds," he explained, climbing up beside her. "We'll stop at Clearwater Creek tonight and Redford the next. I've got a tarp and bedroll for you. We'll find proper accommodations where we can." As they pulled away from Cottonwood Creek, Violet felt a curious lightening in her chest. The town had never truly been home. She turned to study her traveling companion as he guided the team of horses with easy confidence. "I appreciate your willingness to escort me, Mr. Quinn Mason." "I know it must be an inconvenience." He glanced at her, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "No inconvenience. I was headed that way with supplies anyway. The cattle drive is just a few beeves I'm delivering to the hotel in Silverdale." They fell into companionable silence as the wagon rattled along the rutted trail. Behind them, several ranch hands guided a small herd of cattle. The morning air was still cool, filled with the scents of dust and sage. "I was sorry to hear about Thomas," Mason said eventually. "We weren't close, but losing kin is never easy. Thank you, it was unexpected, and now you're bound for Silverdale. New beginnings," Violet nodded. "A position at a boarding house, Mrs. Holbrook's sister." "Elizabeth Granger's place, I know it. Respectable establishment." "She serves the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi." The conversation flowed more easily than Violet had expected. Mason Quinn was nothing like his taciturn cousin or his formidable aunt. He spoke thoughtfully about his small ranch, his hopes for expanding his herd, the books he read during the quiet winter months. Violet found herself sharing more than she intended her love of literature, her dreams of someday writing stories of frontier life from a woman's perspective. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples, Violet realized she'd talked more freely in those few hours than she had in 2 years of marriage to Thomas. "You're not what I expected," she admitted as they sat in the shade of a lone oak tree. Mason raised an eyebrow. Oh, the Quinns I've known aren't exactly. She hesitated, suddenly aware she was speaking to a member of the family that had made her feel so inadequate. Aren't exactly warm or talkative? Mason finished with a wry smile. My branch fell from the Quinn family tree and rolled quite a distance from the root. My father preferred horses to politics, and my mother taught me that listening was more valuable than pronouncing judgment. Aunt Margaret never approved. No, she wouldn't, Violet said quietly. Your aunt made it very clear what she thought of me. Mason's expression darkened. I can imagine. Margaret Quinn measures worth by very narrow standards. I failed to meet any of them, especially. Violet swallowed. Especially providing an heir. Mason was quiet for a moment. Thomas's choice of wife was his own, as was his choice to gamble on cattle during a drought instead of diversifying like every experienced rancher advised. His debts aren't your burden to bear, regardless of what my aunt might suggest. The simple statement of support, so unexpected, brought a lump to Violet's throat. She turned away, blinking rapidly. We should continue if we want to reach Clearwater Creek by nightfall, she said, gathering the remains of their meal. The first day's journey passed without incident. They arrived at Clearwater Creek, a tiny settlement consisting of little more than a trading post with rooms for travelers. Mason arranged for Violet to have the only private room while he and his men slept in the common area. The second day brought challenges. Dark clouds gathered by mid-morning, and by noon, rain poured in sheets that turned the trail to mud. The wagon wheels sank and spun, requiring all hands to push through particularly bad stretches. Violet worked alongside the men, her skirts sodden and heavy, pushing when needed and helping to secure the tarp over their supplies. By late afternoon, it was clear they wouldn't reach Redford before dark. The trail had become treacherous, and Mason made the decision to make camp in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside a swollen creek. I'm sorry about this, he told Violet as they worked together to set up a makeshift camp. I'd hoped to get you to proper accommodations tonight. It's hardly your fault, Violet replied, wringing water from her hair. And I'm not made of sugar. I won't melt in the rain. The unexpected quip drew a genuine laugh from Mason, a rich sound that warmed her despite her damp clothes. The ranch hands constructed a lean-to using the tarp and fallen branches, creating a dry space where Violet could change into her spare dress behind a blanket hung for privacy. The rain continued through the night, but their shelter held. Violet lay wrapped in her bedroll, listening to the steady drumming on the tarp above and the occasional low murmur of the men taking turns keeping watch. Mason had insisted on giving her the driest spot, tucked against the trunk of a massive cottonwood. His consideration throughout the journey had been unfailing but never condescending, a balance Violet hadn't experienced often with men. Dawn broke with clearing skies and the promise of better travel. As they broke camp, Mason worked alongside Violet, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. She caught him watching her once or twice, his expression unreadable before he turned away. The trail to Redford was slow-going but passable. They arrived by late afternoon, mud-splattered but in good spirits. The small town offered a proper inn where Violet could enjoy the luxury of a hot bath and clean sheets. At dinner in the inn's dining room, Mason seemed more reserved than he had been on the trail, almost formal in his courtesy. Is something troubling you? Violet finally asked as they shared a simple meal of stew and cornbread. Mason hesitated. I received a telegram from Cottonwood Creek. Aunt Margaret has learned of our traveling arrangement and has expressed concerns about propriety. Violet's appetite vanished. Of course. I should have realized. Your aunt would see impropriety in the most innocent situation. Her opinion means nothing to me, Mason said firmly. I only mention it because she's threatened to write ahead to Mrs. Granger, suggesting your character might be compromised by our journey. Anger flashed through Violet. My position, my future, she would try to ruin that too. I won't let that happen, Mason assured her. I've already sent a telegram to Mrs. Granger explaining the circumstances and vouching for your character. Mrs. Holbrook has done the same. Why would you do that for me? You barely know me. Mason's eyes, warm amber in the lamplight, held her steadily. I know enough. I know you faced Margaret Quinn's disdain with dignity for 2 years. I know you worked at Davis's store rather than accepting charity. I know you pushed a wagon through mud without a single complaint when most women of my acquaintance would have dissolved into tears. His words hung between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Violet looked down at her untouched stew. "Thank you," she said simply. The final day's journey to Silverdale began in companionable silence that gradually eased into conversation. Mason told stories of his travels, of the characters he'd met on cattle drives and in mining towns. Violet shared childhood memories of growing up with books as her closest companions, of learning to see beauty in the harsh landscape that had intimidated her when she first arrived from Philadelphia at age 12. As the wagon crested a ridge, Silverdale came into view below a bustling town nestled in a valley, larger and more prosperous-looking than Cottonwood Creek. Violet felt a flutter of both excitement and trepidation. "It's bigger than I expected," she admitted. "The silver mines have brought money and people," Mason explained. "It's a young town still finding its character. There's opportunity here for those willing to work." They entered Silverdale by mid-afternoon. Mrs. Granger's boarding house was a handsome 3-story structure on a tree-lined street away from the noisier business district. It exuded respectability, with its fresh white paint and neat garden. Elizabeth Granger herself met them at the door, a sprightly woman in her 60s with Mrs. Holbrook's kind eyes and practical demeanor. She welcomed Violet warmly, showing no sign that Margaret Quinn's threatened letter had arrived or mattered. "You're just in time," she told Violet. "We have new boarders arriving tomorrow, and I could use help preparing the rooms." "My sister wrote your handy with accounts as well." "Excellent. Mine are in a terrible muddle." As Mason carried Violet's trunk to the small but pleasant room that would be hers, Mrs. Granger watched with undisguised interest. "Will you be staying in Silverdale long, Mr. Quinn?" she asked. "Just long enough to deliver my cattle and collect supplies," he answered. "I should be on my way back by tomorrow afternoon." A flicker of disappointment crossed Violet's face before she could master it. She'd grown accustomed to Mason's presence, his quiet strength and unexpected insights. The prospect of his departure left her feeling strangely bereft. "You must join us for dinner tonight," Mrs. Granger insisted. "I always cook too much and growing men need feeding." After settling in and washing away the trail dust, Violet helped Mrs. Granger prepare dinner. The older woman was easy to talk to, full of practical wisdom and gossip about Silverdale's residents. "Now, about young Mr. Quinn," Mrs. Granger said as they kneaded bread dough. "Handsome fellow, and those eyes, reminds me of my Harold, God rest him." "The way he looks at you when you're not watching well, Mrs. Granger." Violet felt heat rising to her cheeks. "It's not like that. Mr. Quinn was simply being kind, escorting a widow safely to her destination. And I'm Queen Victoria." Mrs. Granger's eyes twinkled. "I've lived long enough to recognize a man with intentions, whether he knows it himself or not." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with 2 other boarders joining them, Miss Peters, a schoolteacher, and Mrs. Whitman, a widow who worked at the mercantile. The conversation flowed easily, and Violet found herself relaxing into the company of these independent women. Mason, seated across from her, contributed to the conversation with his usual thoughtfulness, but Violet caught him watching her more than once with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. After dinner, Mrs. Granger shooed them onto the front porch, claiming they were young and should enjoy the evening air while she washed up with the other ladies' help. The sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as they sat on the porch swing, a respectable distance between them. The street was quiet, with only occasional passers-by. "You'll do well here," Mason said after a comfortable silence. "Mrs. Granger already thinks highly of you. She's kind, like her sister." Violet smoothed her skirts. "I'm grateful for this chance. You earned it." Mason turned to face her. "Violet, I need to tell you something before I leave tomorrow." Her heart quickened. "Yes. I knew who you were before Mrs. Holbrook approached me about escorting you to Silverdale. I remembered you from Thomas's wedding. You were reading by yourself under a tree while everyone else was celebrating." Violet remembered that day, how out of place she'd felt among the Quinn family's cold scrutiny. You noticed that? I noticed you, he said simply. When I heard what happened with Thomas and how Margaret was treating you, I wanted to help but didn't know how. When Mrs. Holbrook mentioned you needed passage to Silverdale, it seemed like providence. You specifically offered to bring me, Violet asked, surprised. I did. And I'd do it again. These past 3 days have only confirmed what I suspected at that wedding, that Thomas Quinn had found a remarkable woman and hadn't the sense to truly appreciate her. Violet's breath caught. Mason, I know it's too soon, he said quickly. You're newly widowed, starting a new life. I have no right to speak this way. But before I leave tomorrow, I wanted you to know that whatever Margaret Quinn said about you being useless, it's the furthest thing from truth I've ever heard. The conviction in his voice made her eyes sting. Thank you. But you hardly know me. I'd like to change that. His gaze held her steadily. I make regular supply runs to Silverdale every 2 months. With your permission, I'd like to call on you when I'm in town, properly with Mrs. Granger's approval. No expectations, just a chance to know you better. The offer hung between them, full of possibility. Violet thought of the journey they'd shared, how easy it had been to talk with him, how he'd seen her clearly in a way Thomas never had. I'd like that, she answered softly. His smile transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Then I'll look forward to October. The next morning, Mason departed as planned after a brief farewell at the boarding house. Mrs. Granger, watching from the doorway, merely smiled knowingly as Violet stood on the porch until his wagon disappeared from view. Life at the boarding house quickly established a comfortable rhythm. Violet took to her duties with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 2 difficult years with Margaret Quinn. She organized Mrs. Granger's chaotic accounts, helped prepare meals, and managed correspondence with potential boarders. In her free time, she explored Silverdale, discovering its small library and a women's literary society that welcomed her enthusiastically. Letters arrived occasionally from Mrs. Holbrook, keeping her informed of Cottonwood Creek happenings. Thomas's debts had been settled with the sale of their house. Margaret Quinn had apparently expressed outrage at Violet's scandalous departure with Mason, but the story had gained little traction in town. Most folks, Mrs. Holbrook wrote, remember how that woman treated you and sighed with you in the matter. Mason Quinn has a solid reputation, and anyone with sense knows he acted honorably. True to his word, Mason returned to Silverdale in October. His arrival coincided with the town's harvest festival, and Mrs. Granger insisted they attend together. Under the watchful but approving eye of their chaperone, Violet and Mason spent a pleasant afternoon exploring the festivities. His obvious admiration warmed her, but he remained respectful of her still recent widowhood, making no declarations beyond his clear enjoyment of her company. During his December visit, they attended a Christmas concert at the church, their gloved hands touching briefly as they shared a hymnal. By his February journey, Violet had begun to anticipate his arrivals with a fluttering excitement she'd never experienced with Thomas. In April of 1876, a full year after Thomas's death, Mason arrived in Silverdale with more than his usual supplies. He called at the boarding house with a formal bouquet and an invitation to dinner at the hotel's restaurant, Silverdale's finest establishment. Mrs. Granger has already granted her permission, he assured Violet with a smile that reached his amber eyes. Though she extracted a promise that we'd return by 9 o'clock. That evening, seated across from Mason in the hotel's dining room, Violet felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. He listened intently as she shared her dreams of someday writing about women's experiences on the frontier, offering encouragement rather than dismissal. You have the education and insight for it, he said, and your experience gives you a perspective most writers lack. After dinner, as they walked slowly back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Mason stopped and turned to her. Violet, I've respected your mourning period and tried to be patient, but I need to speak plainly now. He took a deep breath. This past year, getting to know you through letters and visits has been the best of my life. I find myself counting days between journeys to Silverdale, not for business reasons, but because each time I leave you, I feel like I'm leaving part of myself behind. Violet's heart pounded in her chest. Mason, you don't have to answer now, he hurried on. But I want you to know that I love you, your strength, your intelligence, your kind heart. Margaret Quinn called you useless, but you're everything I've ever needed or wanted in a partner. I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife, not now necessarily, but someday when you're ready. Tears welled in Violet's eyes as a year's worth of growing feelings crystallized into certainty. Her marriage to Thomas had been an arrangement of convenience and escape. What Mason offered was something entirely different, a partnership based on genuine affection and respect. I don't need time, she said softly. This past year has shown me what true companionship could be. Yes, Mason, yes, I'll marry you. His face lit with joy as he took her hand in his. You're sure? My ranch is small compared to the Quinn property. Life there would be simpler than what you might have had with Thomas. Violet squeezed his hand. What I might have had with Thomas was a lifetime of trying to meet impossible expectations. What you're offering is something far more valuable, a chance to be appreciated for who I am. Mrs. Granger wept happy tears when they shared their news, insisting on hosting their wedding at the boarding house that June. Mason rode back to his ranch to make preparations, promising to return within the month. To Violet's surprise, a letter arrived from Mrs. Holbrook the following week, responding to the news she'd shared of her engagement. Margaret Quinn is beside herself, Mrs. Holbrook wrote. She's telling anyone who'll listen that you've ensnared her nephew with unseemly haste. Few pay her any mind, most remember how that woman treated you and are delighted by your good fortune. Mason Quinn is well respected, and those who know him say he's been half in love with you since he first saw you at your wedding to Thomas. Perhaps some good can come from difficult beginnings after all. On a warm June morning in 1876, Violet Gardner married Mason Quinn in the garden of Mrs. Granger's boarding house. Mrs. Holbrook made the journey to stand as Violet's witness. The ceremony was simple but joyful, attended by the boarding house residents and Mason's ranch hands who had ridden in for the occasion. Margaret Quinn was conspicuously absent, having declined the invitation Mason had sent out of family obligation. Her absence felt more like a blessing than a slight. As they exchanged vows under an arbor of climbing roses, Violet looked into Mason's amber eyes and saw her future not as someone's disappointing wife or unwanted daughter, but as a valued partner. You are all I've ever needed, Mason whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger. All I'll ever need. 6 months later, at their small ranch north of Cottonwood Creek, Violet sat at her desk by the window, finishing the final pages of her first manuscript, Frontier Women, True Stories of Courage on the Western Edge. The publisher in Denver had expressed interest based on her initial chapters, seeing value in perspectives rarely captured in print. Mason entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside her. How's the writing coming, Mrs. Quinn? She smiled up at her husband. Nearly finished. Thanks to your encouragement. He leaned down to kiss her forehead. Your words will matter to many women. I'm proud of you. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder before he turned to leave, giving her space to work as he always did. Violet caught his hand, bringing it to rest on her stomach, which had just begun to show the slightest curve. We'll need to add a room to the house, she said softly. By spring, Mason's eyes widened, then filled with wonder as understanding dawned. He knelt beside her chair, his hand still covering the new life they'd created. Are you certain? Violet nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. Mrs. Holbrook confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Mason. His answering smile was radiant. Thank you, he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. For choosing me, for creating this life with me. Outside their window, the Texas sunset painted the sky in brilliant golds and purples. Inside, in the home they were building together, Violet had finally found what she'd always sought, not just security or escape, but true belonging. Useless, Margaret Quinn had called her, but in Mason's eyes and now in her own, she was everything.